For many years, decades even, the wealthy Nordic social democracies were seen as the perfect haven for immigration. Regardless of origin, race, religion, or any other condition, most of these countries were built due to the arrival of hundreds of thousands of foreigners. Even so, for some time now, this open-door attitude has begun to change. Migration policy has even been decisive in driving changes in government. For instance, 2 of the 4 continental Nordic countries are no longer in the hands of social democratic parties. Conservative governments have made inroads in Sweden and Finland, while in Denmark, the government is formed by a large coalition of social democrats and conservative liberals. This latter case may seem an odd mix, but we're talking about a country that has been particularly tough on illegal immigration and very restrictive in terms of refugee policies for years now, no matter who actually governs. Look at this.
Mette Frederiksen, the face of the anti-immigration left in Denmark, advocating a zero-refugee policy. Her government has pursued a controversial project to relocate asylum seekers to Rwanda while their applications are processed. The country has also revoked residence permits for Syrians hailing from regions it considers safe.
And of course, at this point, many of you may be wondering, why is it that the Nordic countries, which have traditionally been so open and so tolerant of the arrival of migrants, are now radically changing their tune? More importantly, what kind of policies are they putting in place? And why are we talking about them on Visual Politic? Could this be a taste of what is to come in the next few years? Well, these questions and more will be answered coming up. Step on the gas and let's get started. The first question I think we have to answer is, why? Why are the Nordic nations becoming more and more reluctant on the immigration issue? What on earth has happened to bring about such a change? Well, the truth is that the answer is complex, and there are many variables involved. For example, the insufficient capacity to integrate so many people from so many different cultures may be causing, as we shall soon see, some security issues. But by far the greatest influence on this paradigm shift has had to do with the welfare state. Undoubtedly, the backbone of the social cohesion model in these countries. It is no secret that in Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland, the state plays a central role in protecting people. It is by far the best known feature of the Nordic countries. Basically, if you are born in one of these countries, you will almost certainly have no problem accessing healthcare, a home, a pension, and subsidies of any kind, especially when it comes to promoting increasing birth rates. This chart makes it very clear. To give you an idea, the 5 Nordic countries are in the top 10 countries with the highest spending on education and healthcare as a percentage of GDP. And right up there on the podium, we find 2 of them, Iceland and Denmark. Naturally, these elephantine welfare states have to be financed in some way, for instance, through taxes. The Nordic countries have a tax burden of more than 40%, and obviously the fact that they are historically rich, advanced, and very competitive economies also helps them to have first-class public services. This means that in these countries, a high percentage of workers are highly qualified professionals with high salaries. This makes it easier for the state to collect a lot of money and maintain very high social benefits without excessively limiting the purchasing power of its workers and the competitiveness of its companies. So, what is the problem? Well, the problem is that a very large number of the immigrants that these countries have received in recent years are people without good educational or professional training, and that greatly limits their fiscal contribution, while at the same time, they tend to consume more public resources. The lack of qualifications also leads to serious problems in accessing the labour market, despite the fact that we are talking about countries with very low levels of unemployment. And that's not all. Since social benefits in these countries tends to be very generous, they sometimes have a pull effect. Let's just say that it can become more profitable to receive subsidies than to have a low-skilled job. The issue is that, in the long run, this leads to integration problems, a much more widespread underground economy, and also to the emergence of criminal groups. We already talked about the latter in a past video about Sweden, which, if you are watching this video, I think you will also be very interested in it. I'll leave the link in the description. The point is that, for all these reasons, the large increase in immigration that has taken place in Europe in recent years has had a much greater impact on the welfarist Nordic states than on other European countries. Think about it for a moment. The incentive for people to go to countries with so many subsidies is enormous, which logically has also led to a significant increase in social spending in these countries. Then on top of that, if we add the increase of refugees registered since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, the cocktail becomes even more bitter. Visual politic community, all that we are telling you has had two very clear effects. On the one hand, the Nordics are seeing how their public services and welfare state are degrading, basically because there are more and more claimants. Claimants who, in most cases, have contributed nothing or very little to the system. This generates an important structural gap in the short and medium term. And on the other hand, we have the economic and financial effect, as some countries have had to choose either to cut benefits or to increase taxes.
Norway to hike taxes by $3 billion on power firms, fish farms, costs linked to taking in refugees, ongoing public construction projects, benefit payments, and household power subsidies will rise by some 100 billion crowns in 2023, the government has said.
We're talking about a scenario that is starting to cause a lot of unrest. And precisely to curb this drift, the old and well-known Nordic social democracies are tightening the requirements for access to public benefits, while also doing away with their open door policy and their traditionally tolerant stance on immigration.
Finland's new government announces paradigm shift with immigration crackdown. Residence permits granted under international protection will become temporary and their duration will be reduced to the EU minimum. They will in future be withdrawn if a person is on holiday in their country of origin. It also aims to establish separate social security benefit systems for immigrants and permanent residents.
Now, if all this is not enough for you, give us a moment, because we have only just begun.
Nordic states to tighten collaboration on migrant deportations. One common goal was ensuring the deportation of foreigners without residence permits to their countries of origin.
On the 31st of October 2023, the 5 Nordic countries signed 3 initiatives that represent a further step in this complete paradigm shift. We are talking about a new strategy to promote the voluntary departure of immigrants and refugees, as well as the expulsion of illegal immigrants. Nevertheless, even taking this change into account, the truth is that one country in particular is being the toughest by far in trying to tackle the problems that have been caused in recent decades. A country where the iron fist is a general consensus among all political forces. We are talking about Denmark. What we are going to tell you may surprise many of you, and above all, it may change your opinion or the image that you have of the land of Lego and licorice. Just 3 decades ago, Denmark was one of the most open to immigration and refugees in all of Europe, and perhaps the world. It was also one of the countries that put the most aid on the table. Yet, not even a shadow of that Denmark remains today. So naturally the question is, what exactly are we talking about when we say that Denmark is using an iron fist? Is it perhaps the advanced pupil that is leading the way for a new policy throughout Europe? Well, let's take a look.
By hook or by crook?
As we have already told you, Denmark is by far the Nordic country that has taken the most radical approach against illegal immigration, the toughest country in the Nordic region and, perhaps, in the whole of Europe. Let us point out that this is not something strictly new. It is not a decision that was taken just the day before yesterday. And to illustrate that, we have the agreements that Denmark signed, and, more importantly, those that it did not sign within the framework of the European Union. You see, after the Danes rejected the Maastricht Treaty in the first referendum, which is one of the founding treaties of the European Union, the EU authorities agreed with Copenhagen on 4 opt-out clauses. Of these, 2 are still valid and applicable today. Take note. First of all, the Danes would not adopt the euro and would keep the Danish krone, which is obviously not relevant to the subject we're talking about. The second, however, is much more significant. Denmark is also exempt from complying with most of the European laws and obligations concerning, among other things, asylum and the distribution of refugees and irregular immigrants. This was something that was agreed in 1997 with the Amsterdam Treaty, and since then, the truth is that the Danes have pretty much done as they please with their migration policy. Now, what is the greatest indicator of all this? None other than its zero refugee policy. Yes, you heard correctly. Until the war in Ukraine, Denmark accepted hardly any refugees, and those it did accept such as some Syrians fleeing the war are now beginning to be invited to leave. It has even expelled several hundred of them, considering that their regions of origin are already safe zones. To give you an idea, in per capita terms, for every refugee arriving in Denmark, 6 arrive in Germany and Sweden. In 2021, before the war in Ukraine, there were only 36,000 refugees in the country, and in 2020, the country recorded the lowest number of asylum applications in 20 years, just over 1,500. Evidently, this responds to something, and that something is a very hostile policy towards this type of migration. For starters, in 2016, the Danish government passed a law popularly known as the Jewelry Law. This is a controversial law that was passed by a large majority in Parliament. 81 out of 109 of the deputies present, including those from the Social Democratic Party, which was already, at that time, led by the current Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen. Now, what does this law consist of? Well, hold on to your chair. In short, the so-called jewelry law obliges new arrived asylum seekers to hand over their valuables to the Danish state as a way to pay for their stay, including jewelry and gold, with the exception of limited pieces that may have a particular sentimental value. The law also states that refugees arriving in the country with more than 10,000 kroner, that's just under $1,500, have to contribute to the costs of their accommodation. What's more, the law also makes family reunions very difficult. Asylum seekers have to wait at least 3 years before they can apply to bring their families to Denmark. All this is obviously aimed at discouraging refugees from choosing Denmark as an option, as there are many other options in Europe with more welcoming conditions. And the truth is that, in this sense, the law, with the figures in hand, is working. For many, this law is inhumane and racist, especially considering that the Danish government, surprise surprise, did not apply any of the conditions to Ukrainian refugees who came fleeing the war in their country. For others, however, it is a key tool for preventing the formation of ghettos and parallel societies, which is the fundamental motive with which politicians on both the left and the right justify it. But there is still more, much more. When an immigrant or refugee is ordered to leave the country and does not cooperate with the authorities, he or she is placed in a return center in Denmark, where he or she is obliged to reside and spend the night every night. I guess calling them expulsion centers had a less pleasing ring to it. Well, the country has at least 3 return centers for foreigners, in which, in some cases, there are foreigners who spend long periods of time. It is a wait with an uncertain destination. And remember, we are not talking about temporary detention centers for newly arrived illegal immigrants, as we can find in many countries. We are talking about foreigners who were already in Denmark, but who, for whatever reason, have been ordered to be expelled. On top of that, these centers are subject to a regime of conduct, discipline, and very strict rules. There is also a system of penalties for non-compliance, including fines, and even imprisonment. However, if there is one measure that is controversial and radical among all the ones we have told you and have yet to tell you about, it is the one Denmark has taken against the ghettos of foreigners, or as they like to call them, parallel societies. You see, as we explained in the video we made about Sweden, one of the problems that hinders the integration of many immigrants is their concentration in areas where they have little contact with the local society. We're talking about areas, neighborhoods, usually full of public housing that were given to these immigrants because they were considered vulnerable groups. Areas in which closed communities end up being created with their own culture, customary, and sometimes even de facto laws. We're talking about areas where, in many cases, contact with the neighbors in the local population of the host countries is zero. We are also talking about places where a large proportion of the foreign resident population does not have regular jobs or ends up engaging in criminal activities. And of course, exclusion leads to more exclusion, and that never turns out well. In this sense, these areas are the ones that have served as breeding grounds for organized crime in countries such as Sweden, where they are experiencing an unprecedented security problem that is overwhelming the authorities themselves. Well, Denmark is the country in Europe, and perhaps even in the world, that has declared war most harshly on these ghettoized areas, on these parallel societies. For example, in 2018, Denmark passed a controversial law whose major initiative is to reorganize and redesign poor public housing neighborhoods that have a high concentration of non-Western immigrants with a deadline, 2030. It is a plan that was announced by a conservative government, but one that has been implemented by Frederiksen's Social Democratic government. Now, what does this reorganization consist of? Basically, it consists of entering these neighborhoods to take over the houses. In some cases, even entering with bulldozers to demolish public housing. Yes, that's what I said. Previously, the Danish government carried out the forced relocation of its neighbors, who, in some cases, as you can probably imagine, were reluctant to leave their homes.
Denmark aims a wrecking ball at non-Western neighborhoods. A government program is using demolition and relocation to remake neighborhoods with immigrants, poverty, or crime.
Specifically, the law requires that in neighborhoods where at least half of the population is of non-Western origin or ancestry, the proportion of public housing may not exceed 40% of the total. In order to declare an area as susceptible to action, the law indicates that at least two of the following characteristics must be present: low income, poor educational performance, high unemployment, or high percentage of inhabitants with criminal convictions. One of the places that serves as an example of a ghetto is the Mjølneparken neighborhood, where 43% of its residents are unemployed, 82% are of non-Western origin, 53% are poorly educated, and 51% have low incomes. In practice, this means that by 2030, the Danish government will have to demolish or alternatively empty and resell to others more than 4,000 public housing units in such neighborhoods. As of today, about 500 have been already demolished. Many of those that are not demolished and where it has been decided to keep them are sold to investors who renovate them and then sell them at market price to new inhabitants with higher purchasing power. In practice, the idea is to relocate and dilute the immigrant population within Danish society, preventing foreigners from concentrating in specific areas, from isolating themselves from the rest of society, and thus failing to integrate. Conceptually, the idea is not bad. What is more controversial is the forced and compulsory approach that has been taken in Denmark.
We take the basic view that concentrating social problems increases social problems. We do not believe it's advantageous to grow up in a neighborhood where there are many social and integration-related problems.
I imagine there will be opinions across the board here. But we're not done yet. There's still more. Apart from this housing and rehousing policy, Denmark also decrees that young children in these areas spend at least 25 hours a week in preschools, where they are taught the Danish language, and I quote, Danish values. And while it is still too early to tell whether these measures will succeed or fail, what we do know is that Denmark is becoming something of a laboratory for many European countries with similar problems. Of course, one of the risks that exists, and it is not exactly a minor risk, is that the policy of forced relocations and a heavy hand against refugees and illegal immigration will increase the feeling of unsettledness. When a person feels very rootless, singled out, and stigmatized by the society around them, they can, in some cases, develop anger and hatred that can lead to higher levels of radicalization and unlawful behaviors. Obviously, this is something that the Danish authorities are aware of and will have to keep an eye on. It is potentially a very significant risk that needs to be taken into account. The thing is, visual politic community, that in Denmark today, the concept of multiculturalism generates a significant social rejection.
In Denmark, multiculturalism is really a negative word.
In other words, that in the land of the Little Mermaid, being an uninvited outsider could lead you headlong into having to navigate more troubled waters. And take note, because what we have told you about the Nordic anti-immigration country par excellence is nothing short of what could be about to start happening in others, such as Sweden or Finland, whose governments have recently turned to the right. The question at this point is, will all these plans work? For now, we'll leave the debate to all of you, so you can leave your opinion below in the comments. And more importantly, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new uploads. And we also remind you that we have a Patreon page through which you can help us to keep growing and improving in exchange for extra content, benefits, and exclusive gifts. We'll leave you the link in the description so you can check it all out. Once again, thank you so much for watching. All the best. See you next time.